I made the biggest mistake of my life on a Friday night in September, and I didn't even know it at the time. My name is Marcus Chen, and I need you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened. I'm not brave. I've never been the guy who takes chances or does anything that might shake up my quiet, predictable world. I'm 31 years old, and I sell medical devices to hospitals around Phoenix. Every morning I wake up at 6:30, make coffee in the same white mug, drive the same route to work, and come home to an apartment that feels emptier every single day. 3 years ago, my girlfriend Rebecca walked out of my life. We'd been together for 4 years, living in a nice place in Tempe, talking about maybe getting married someday. Then one Tuesday evening, she sat me down on our couch and told me she couldn't do it anymore. She said I was playing life like someone afraid to lose rather than someone trying to win. She wanted adventure, risk, someone who chased dreams instead of hiding from nightmares. 3 weeks later, she moved to Seattle for a job at a tech startup, and I stayed right where I was. Same apartment, same routine, same fear wrapped up in excuses about being responsible. Rebecca's last words to me before she drove away were simple, but they cut deep. She said, "Marcus, you're good and kind, but that's not enough. I need someone who actually wants something." I spent months turning those words over in my head, examining them from every angle, and eventually I decided she was right. I wasn't enough. So instead of trying to become more, I just accepted being less. I stopped reaching for anything that might require me to be vulnerable or uncertain. I built my entire life around avoiding discomfort. That's who I was when my manager Diane sent an email saying our whole sales team had to attend a charity fundraiser in Paradise Valley. She made it very clear that this wasn't optional. The company had donated $10,000 for a table, and we needed to show up and represent. I put on my charcoal suit, the one I kept in the back of my closet for job interviews I never pursued, and drove 40 minutes north into a world I didn't belong in. The venue was enormous. High ceilings, massive chandeliers throwing light across marble floors, waiters walking around with trays of champagne in crystal glasses. Everyone there looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine, women in designer dresses, men in perfectly tailored suits, conversations happening in clusters about investments and vacation homes and fundraising goals. I grabbed a glass of water from a passing tray and found a spot near the back wall where I could blend into the background. That's when I saw the painting. It hung on the wall near a decorative screen made of dark wood with carved patterns. The painting showed a desert landscape at sunset, all oranges and purples bleeding together, with a single road disappearing into mountains in the distance. Something about it made me stop and stare, maybe because it captured the feeling of going nowhere while pretending you had a destination. Then I heard crying. Not loud sobbing, but the quiet kind. The kind someone makes when they're trying desperately not to be heard. I turned my head slowly and looked past the decorative screen. That's where I saw her, Margaret Sullivan, sitting on a small bench pushed against the wall, her face buried in her hands. I recognized her immediately even though I hadn't seen her in 3 years. She was Rebecca's mother. I used to sit at her dining room table every other Sunday, eating her homemade lasagna while she asked Rebecca about work and told funny stories about her younger days as a freelance photographer. She always made me feel welcome, always smiled when I walked through the door, always asked how my week had been like she actually cared about the answer. But the woman sitting on that bench looked nothing like the person I remembered. She seemed smaller somehow, like she'd shrunk into herself. Her shoulders curved forward, her head down, her whole body trying to take up as little space as possible. She wore a beautiful navy blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, but it hung on her like she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her makeup was smudged under her left eye where she'd wiped away tears with her fingers. I should have walked away right then. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around and pretend I hadn't seen anything. This was Rebecca's mother, a direct connection to the most painful chapter of my life, a reminder of every way I'd failed to be enough. The absolute last person I wanted to talk to at an event I already didn't want to attend. But I stood there watching her for maybe 30 seconds. In that short time, I saw her press both hands over her mouth to muffle a sound trying to escape. I saw her shoulders shake once, twice, like she was fighting something inside herself that wanted to break loose. I saw her look around quickly to make sure nobody was watching, then close her eyes and take 3 deep breaths like she was trying to force herself back together through sheer willpower. Something about that image hooked itself into my chest and wouldn't let go. I recognized what I was seeing because I'd lived it myself. That was what loneliness looked like when you'd gotten so good at hiding it that even you almost believed the mask. I walked over slowly, my dress shoes quiet on the marble floor. When I got close enough, I said her name softly so I wouldn't startle her. Mrs. Sullivan. She jumped anyway, actually flinched like I'd appeared out of nowhere. Her head snapped up and her eyes went wide, confused for a second like she couldn't place my face. Then recognition clicked into place. Marcus, she said. Her voice sounded hollow, scraped clean of anything resembling energy. I didn't know you'd be here. Work thing, I said. Are you okay? It was a stupid question. She obviously wasn't okay, but it was the only thing my brain could produce in that moment. Margaret laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was short and bitter, the sound someone makes when they've given up pretending. Do I look okay? I didn't have an answer for that. We stood there in awkward silence while music played somewhere in the background and people walked past us completely unaware that this woman was barely holding herself together. She broke the silence first. David was supposed to come with me tonight, she said quietly. David Sullivan, Rebecca's father. I'd met him maybe 5 times when Rebecca and I were together. Tall guy, always wore expensive suits that fit him perfectly, always had his phone in his hand checking emails or taking calls. He built commercial real estate, office parks, and medical plazas all over Arizona. The kind of man who walked into rooms and immediately became the center of attention whether he wanted to be or not. He owns the development company that sponsored this whole event, Margaret continued. Her voice was flat, emotionless, like she was reading facts off a page. But he called me an hour ago and said he had an important conference call with investors in California. Told me to enjoy myself and call a car service when I was ready to leave. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup even more. Like I'm just another item on his schedule. He can reschedule when something more important comes up. I felt my stomach tighten. I'd never liked David much during the brief times I'd been around him, but hearing this made something cold settle in my chest. I'm sorry, I said, because I couldn't think of anything else. Margaret looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were searching my face for something, though I had no idea what. You were always kind, Marcus, she said quietly. Rebecca didn't deserve you. She should have fought harder to keep you. That sentence hit me somewhere deep, somewhere I'd locked away and tried to forget about. I shifted my weight and looked down at my shoes, suddenly uncomfortable. I should probably get going, I said. Wait. Margaret reached out and grabbed my arm. Her hand was ice cold even though the ballroom was warm. Her fingers trembled against my sleeve. I can't go home yet. I can't walk into that big empty house and sit there alone waiting for David to finish his call and come back pretending everything is fine. I just need to talk to someone for a little while. Someone who doesn't know David, who won't judge me or tell me I'm overreacting. There was something raw in her voice that I recognized immediately. A hollow desperation. The kind where you know something is deeply wrong but you have no idea how to fix it or even where to start. Do you want to grab coffee somewhere? I heard myself offer. Margaret shook her head quickly. Not here. Not anywhere in Paradise Valley where someone might see us and tell David. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can just be Margaret for an hour instead of David Sullivan's wife. That's when my brain caught up with what was happening. This was my ex-girlfriend's mother asking me to take her somewhere private, away from her husband, away from anyone who might know them. Every alarm bell in my head started ringing at once. I stood there in that ballroom staring at Margaret Sullivan's tear-stained face, and my mouth went completely dry. This wasn't just awkward. This was dangerous territory. This was the kind of situation that could get twisted and misunderstood in 100 different ways. This was Rebecca's mother, a married woman, asking me to take her somewhere alone. Every single reasonable thought in my brain was screaming at me to politely decline, to suggest she call her sister or a friend, to extract myself from whatever this was before it became something I couldn't walk away from. I opened my mouth to say yes. The word was right there, ready to come out. But then something stopped me. It wasn't noble or brave. It was the opposite. It was that same old familiar instinct that had ruled my life for the past 3 years. The instinct to protect myself, to avoid complications, to stay safe inside the walls I'd built. I thought about what saying yes would mean. Getting involved in someone else's marriage problems. Potentially putting myself in a position where David Sullivan, a powerful businessman with connections all over Phoenix, might decide I was a threat. Opening myself up to gossip or accusations or drama that could spill over into my work life. Letting someone else's pain become my responsibility. And underneath all those practical concerns was something deeper, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. I was scared. Scared of feeling anything real again. Scared of caring about someone who might need me. Scared of being the kind of person who shows up when things get messy instead of the kind who keeps his hands clean and his life simple. "Mrs. Sullivan," I said slowly, pulling my arm back gently so her hand fell away. "I don't think that's a good idea." The words came out softer than I intended, but they still landed hard. I watched something change in her expression. The desperate hope that had been there a second ago flickered and died like a candle going out. "I'm really sorry you're going through this," I continued, the words tumbling out faster now because I needed to fill the silence. "But I think you should call your sister, or maybe a close friend. Someone who knows you better than I do. Someone who can actually help." Margaret nodded slowly. She wasn't looking at me anymore. Her eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere distant and unreachable. "Of course," she said quietly. "You're right. I shouldn't have asked. That was inappropriate of me." "It's not that," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. It was exactly that. I was choosing not to help because helping felt too complicated, too risky, too much like stepping outside the safe little bubble I'd built for myself. "I have an early morning tomorrow," I added, which was a lie. I had nothing planned for Saturday except maybe grocery shopping and watching basketball on TV. "But I hope things get better for you. I really do." Margaret stood up from the bench. She smoothed down her dress with shaking hands and wiped under her eyes one more time, trying to fix her smudged makeup with her fingers. It didn't help much. "Thank you anyway, Marcus," she said. Her voice had gone completely flat, all emotion drained out of it. "It was good to see you." She walked away before I could say anything else. I watched her disappear into the crowd of people near the bar, her shoulders still curved inward, her steps careful and measured like someone trying very hard not to stumble. I stood there for another 10 minutes feeling sick to my stomach. Then I left the fundraiser without saying goodbye to anyone from my office. I drove home in complete silence. No radio, no music, just the sound of my tires on pavement and my own thoughts echoing too loud inside my head. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on my couch in the dark and told myself I'd made the right choice. The smart choice. The safe choice. Getting involved in someone else's marital problems was a recipe for disaster. I barely knew Margaret Sullivan anymore. Whatever was happening in her marriage wasn't my responsibility. I'd done the mature thing by setting a boundary and protecting myself from unnecessary drama. I repeated these justifications to myself over and over like a mantra, but they didn't make the knot in my stomach go away. They didn't stop me from seeing Margaret's face when I'd pulled my arm back and said no. They didn't erase the memory of how small she'd looked sitting on that bench trying to hold herself together with sheer willpower. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I should have handled it differently. Around 2 in the morning, I finally admitted to myself what was really bothering me. It wasn't guilt about Margaret specifically. It was the realization that I'd become exactly the kind of person I never wanted to be. Someone who walked away from other people's pain because it might be inconvenient. Someone who chose comfort over compassion every single time. Someone who'd spent 3 years building a life so small and safe that there was barely room for anyone else inside it. Rebecca had told me I was playing not to lose instead of playing to win. She'd been right, but it was worse than that. I wasn't even playing anymore. I was just sitting on the sidelines watching everyone else live their lives while I counted the ways I might get hurt if I stepped onto the field. The weekend dragged by. Saturday and Sunday blurred together into a fog of trying to distract myself and failing. I went grocery shopping like I'd planned. I watched basketball. I cleaned my apartment even though it was already clean. None of it helped. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's face. Monday morning I went to work and tried to focus on sales calls and inventory reports. Tuesday was the same. Wednesday I had a meeting with a hospital administrator that should have had my full attention, but halfway through her questions about equipment specifications, I realized I had no idea what she just asked me. Then on Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the fundraiser, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Marcus, this is Margaret Sullivan. I got your number from Rebecca's old contacts. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stared at the message for a full minute before my hands stopped shaking enough to type a response. "Of course it's okay. Is everything all right?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. When her reply finally came through, it was longer than I expected. "I filed for divorce this week. I hired a lawyer named Patricia Chun on Monday and signed all the paperwork yesterday. I've been thinking about doing it for months, but I couldn't make myself take the step. That night at the fundraiser was my breaking point. When you walked away and I sat there alone on that bench, something clicked for me. I realized that if even a kind person like you wouldn't spare an hour to have coffee with me, maybe I'd become someone not worth helping. Maybe I disappeared so completely into being David's wife that there wasn't enough of me left to save." I read those words 3 times. Each time they hit harder than the last. She thought I'd walked away because she wasn't worth helping. She'd taken my self-protective cowardice and turned it into proof that she'd failed as a person. My hands were shaking again as I typed back. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I didn't walk away because you weren't worth helping. I walked away because I was scared. I've spent the last 3 years avoiding anything that might be complicated or painful or require me to actually show up for someone else. What I did that night had nothing to do with you and everything to do with me being a coward." The response came fast. "You don't need to apologize. I understand why you said no. We barely know each other anymore, and getting involved in someone else's marriage disaster is asking a lot. But I wanted you to know that it helped anyway, in a strange way. It was the wake-up call I needed." I sat at my desk staring at my phone screen. My office mate Jerry was talking on a call 2 desks over. Someone's printer was making a grinding noise down the hall. Normal office sounds on a normal Thursday afternoon. But I felt like the ground had shifted under my feet. "Can I buy you lunch?" I typed. "Today or tomorrow or whenever works for you. I'd really like to talk in person if you're open to it." This time the 3 dots appeared and stayed. Finally, her message came through. "Tomorrow at noon? There's a cafe called Rosemary's in Chandler, kind of out of the way. Nobody there knows me or David." "I'll be there," I wrote back. I spent the next 24 hours not knowing what I was going to say to her. Part of me wanted to apologize again, to explain myself better, to make her understand that walking away had nothing to do with her value as a person. Another part wanted to ask if she was okay, if she was safe, if she needed help with anything practical like finding a place to stay or dealing with lawyers. But mostly I just wanted to see her face and know for certain whether I'd made things worse by choosing safety over showing up. Friday morning crawled by at half speed. I got to Rosemary's 20 minutes early and ordered coffee I was too nervous to drink. The cafe was small and quiet, wooden tables with mismatched chairs, local artwork on exposed brick walls. The kind of place where nobody looked twice at strangers having serious conversations. Margaret walked in at exactly noon. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She wore jeans and a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail with a few strands falling around her face. No jewelry except small silver earrings. No makeup that I could see. She looked younger than she had at the fundraiser, but also more tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. When she spotted me, something in her expression softened. Not quite a smile, but close. She ordered tea at the counter and sat down across from me. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "Thank you for giving me another chance," I replied. We sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy with everything that hadn't been said yet. Margaret spoke first. I meant what I texted. You don't need to apologize for that night. You were protecting yourself, and that's completely reasonable. It wasn't reasonable, I said. It was selfish. You asked for help, and I said no because I was more worried about my own comfort than your pain. She wrapped both hands around her teacup, and I noticed she was doing it the same way she'd held onto my arm at the fundraiser, like she needed something solid to anchor herself. Margaret looked at me across that small cafe table and said something I'll never forget. Marcus, the reason I texted you wasn't to make you feel guilty. It was because you're the only person in my life who ever knew me before I became Mrs. David Sullivan. And right now, I need to remember that version of myself existed. Her words hung in the air between us while the cafe hummed with quiet conversation around us. A barista called out someone's order. A couple near the window laughed about something on their phone. Normal life happening while we sat in the middle of something that felt anything but normal. Tell me what's happening, I said. With the divorce. With everything. Margaret took a sip of her tea, and I could see her hands were steadier than they'd been at the fundraiser. But only slightly. Patricia, my lawyer, she warned me about what comes next. She said David will fight this. Not because he loves me or wants to save our marriage. He doesn't. We've barely spoken to each other in years except to coordinate schedules. But he'll fight because he doesn't lose. Losing makes him look weak, and image is the only thing David actually cares about. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message from someone named Jennifer. The message said, I think you should take some time to focus on your mental health before making any major life decisions. We're all worried about you. Jennifer was my closest friend, Margaret explained. We've known each other for 12 years. We took pottery classes together. We went to yoga every Thursday morning. 3 days after I told her about the divorce, she sent me this text and hasn't responded to anything since. She scrolled to another message, this one from someone named Diane. I care about you, but I can't get involved in your situation with David. I hope you understand. Then another from someone named Nicole. Maybe you and David just need some space to work things out. Divorce seems so extreme. I watched Margaret's face as she showed me message after message. Women who'd called themselves her friends were backing away one by one, offering excuses wrapped in concern, suggesting she was making a mistake or having some kind of breakdown. This is David's work, Margaret said quietly, putting her phone face down on the table. He didn't tell them to abandon me. He's too smart for that. He just mentioned to the right people that I'd been acting erratic lately, that he was worried about my stress levels, that our marriage had been strained because I'd been struggling emotionally. He plants seeds and lets other people draw their own conclusions. My jaw tightened. That's disgusting. That's strategy, Margaret corrected. And it's working. My own sister Karen called me last week and asked if I'd considered seeing a therapist before going through with the divorce. Karen, who watched David ignore me for 20 years, who listened to me cry about feeling invisible in my own marriage. Even she's starting to wonder if maybe David's right and I'm just unstable. I leaned forward, elbows on the table. You're not unstable. You're finally standing up for yourself. I know that, Margaret said. But knowing it doesn't make it easier when everyone around you starts looking at you like you might break at any moment. We sat with that for a while. I finished my coffee even though it had gone cold. Margaret stared out the window at cars passing on the street outside. Patricia hired an investigator, she said eventually. Someone to document our actual marriage instead of the version David's trying to sell. She got access to our home security footage from the past 2 years. Did you know we have cameras in almost every room? David installed them years ago, said it was for safety. But the footage shows everything. She pulled up something on her phone and turned it toward me. It was a video timestamp showing a kitchen. David walked in, grabbed something from the refrigerator, and walked out. The timestamp said 6:47 p.m. Another clip showed Margaret sitting alone at a dining room table eating dinner. The timestamp said 7:15 p.m. the same day. We've had separate bedrooms for 9 years, Margaret said. We eat meals separately unless we have guests. We go days without speaking to each other. The footage proves all of it. 2 people living in the same house like strangers who happen to share an address. I didn't know what to say to that. The loneliness of it sat heavy in my chest. Patricia says it helps our case, Margaret continued. But honestly, watching those videos made me feel pathetic. How did I let it get this bad? How did I spend 2 decades becoming so small that I disappeared even when I was standing right there? You're not pathetic, I said firmly. You're human. And sometimes we don't notice we're drowning until someone throws us a lifeline and we realize how deep underwater we've been. Margaret smiled, but it was sad around the edges. Is that what you think you did? Threw me a lifeline? No, I admitted. I think I watched you drowning and convinced myself it wasn't my problem. But I'm here now if that counts for anything. She reached across the table and her hand hovered just above mine. Not quite touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth. It counts for more than you know. We met 4 more times over the next month. Always at different cafes, always in the middle of the day when we could both claim to be on lunch breaks from work. Margaret told me about the divorce proceedings, about settlement offers that came with impossible conditions attached. David's lawyers wanted her to sign agreements saying she wouldn't speak publicly about their marriage, that she'd submit to regular evaluations to prove her mental stability, that she'd forfeit certain assets if she dated anyone within 2 years of the divorce being finalized. Each condition was designed to control her even after the marriage ended. Each one came wrapped in language that sounded reasonable on paper but was actually just another cage with a longer chain. Patricia fought back hard. She presented evidence of emotional neglect that had gone on for years. She showed emails where David scheduled Margaret's entire day down to 15-minute increments, controlling when she could see friends, when she could leave the house, what events she needed to attend. She played audio recordings from their home system where you could hear how David spoke to Margaret like she was an employee he was disappointed in rather than a wife he'd promised to love. The hardest part isn't the legal battle, Margaret told me during our 5th meeting, this time at a small diner in Gilbert. It's realizing how many people in my life only knew me as David's wife. When I try to stand up as just Margaret, they don't recognize me. They think I'm having some kind of identity crisis instead of understanding that I'm finally finding my identity after years of losing it piece by piece. She'd started looking different each time I saw her. Not worse, just different. More real somehow. She wore less makeup. Her clothes were simpler. She didn't apologize for taking up space in conversations. She started sentences with what she wanted instead of what she thought other people expected her to say. I enrolled in a photography class, she told me one afternoon in early November. We were sitting outside at a cafe in Mesa even though the weather was getting cooler. At the Community Arts Center. It's been 22 years since I touched a camera with any real intention. David always said my photography was a nice hobby but nothing to take seriously. He suggested I focus my energy on supporting his career instead of chasing something that would never pay the bills. Her voice had an edge of bitterness when she mentioned David, but underneath it was something else. Excitement maybe, or possibility. The instructor looked at my old portfolio last week, she continued. The one I kept stored in a box in Karen's garage. A long pause. Then free. Terrified. Like I just jumped off a cliff and I'm still falling, but at least I'm not standing at the edge anymore pretending I'm safe. She'd settled for less money than Patricia wanted her to fight for. The legal battle had dragged on so long that Margaret finally decided her sanity was worth more than another 6 months of depositions and negotiations. She got the house in Scottsdale, which she immediately listed for sale because living there felt like wearing someone else's skin. She got a fair split of their savings and investments. She kept her car and her personal belongings and her freedom. David kept everything else. His business, his reputation mostly intact, his carefully constructed image of being a reasonable man whose wife had gone through some kind of midlife crisis. The story he'd planted had taken root. People whispered that Margaret had fallen apart, that the divorce was her choice but probably not her best choice, that she'd thrown away a good marriage because she'd gotten restless or unstable or both. Margaret told me she didn't care what they said anymore. I believed her most days, but some days I could see how much it still hurt to be misunderstood by people she'd known for years. 3 weeks after the divorce was final, I got a text from her asking if I wanted to meet at a farmer's market in Mesa on Saturday morning. Not a cafe this time, Somewhere public and bright and full of life instead of hidden and quiet. I said yes without thinking twice. I found her near a booth selling fresh flowers, holding a bundle of sunflowers and talking to the vendor about whether they'd last longer in water or planted in soil. She wore jeans and a faded blue t-shirt, her hair down around her shoulders, sunglasses pushed up on her head. She looked relaxed in a way I'd never seen before, not performing for anyone, not carefully managing how much space she took up, just existing comfortably in her own skin. When she saw me, her whole face lit up. "Marcus, I was hoping you'd actually show up and not just be polite." "I'm not just being polite," I said, and I meant it. We walked through the market together, stopping at booths selling vegetables and honey and handmade pottery. Margaret bought tomatoes from a farm stand and told the farmer a long story about trying to grow her own tomatoes one summer and accidentally drowning all the plants because she overwatered them. The farmer laughed and gave her advice about drainage and sunlight. It was such a normal interaction, the kind of easy conversation between strangers that happens 1,000 times a day. But watching Margaret have it made something warm settle in my chest. She wasn't performing. She wasn't calculating how to present herself. She was just talking to another human being about tomatoes. We ended up sitting on a bench near the edge of the market, watching families walk past pushing strollers and couples debating which bread to buy. The sunflowers sat between us, bright yellow against the wood. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said after a while. I turned to look at her and felt my stomach tighten with nervousness I didn't understand. "I'm moving," she said. "Not far, just to Tempe. I found a small apartment near the university. 2 bedrooms, one for me and one I'm turning into a photography studio. Good light, hardwood floors, a balcony where I can drink coffee in the mornings without feeling like I'm trespassing in someone else's life." "That sounds perfect," I said, and I meant it even though part of me felt something twist uncomfortably at the thought of her moving, of our already limited meetings becoming even more complicated to arrange. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I've never lived alone before. I went from my parents' house to college roommates to marrying David at 24. I don't know how to just be by myself without someone else's schedule dictating mine." "You'll figure it out," I said, "and you'll be better at it than you think." She smiled, but it was complicated. "The photography instructor wants me to apply for a teaching position at the Arts Center. Just part-time, 1 class a week for beginners. He thinks I'd be good at it." "You would be." "I haven't said yes yet," she said quietly, "because part of me keeps waiting for someone to tell me I'm not qualified, that I'm just David Sullivan's ex-wife pretending to be an artist, that I should go back to being whoever I was before I made this mess of everything." I turned on the bench so I was facing her fully. "You didn't make a mess. You unmade a prison. There's a difference." Margaret's eyes got bright with tears. She blinked back quickly. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" "I don't," I admitted. "Most of the time I have no idea what I'm doing. But I know what it feels like to spend years convincing yourself that being small is the same as being safe. And I know it's not true." We sat quietly for a while after that. Around us, the market buzzed with weekend energy. Someone was playing guitar near the entrance. Kids were laughing at a booth that sold handmade toys. Life happening in all its messy, complicated, beautiful ordinariness. "Marcus," Margaret said eventually, "I want to thank you for not giving up on me. Even after I gave you every reason to walk away, you kept showing up. You listened without judging. You saw me as a whole person instead of just a problem to solve or avoid. That meant more than I know how to put into words." Something tightened in my throat. "You did the same for me," I said. "You reminded me what it feels like to actually care about something outside my own comfort zone. I'd forgotten that was even possible." She reached over and squeezed my hand once, quickly, then let go. "Will you come to my first class? When I teach, if I actually get brave enough to say yes?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. 6 weeks later, I sat in the back row of a community arts center classroom and watched Margaret Sullivan teach 12 strangers the basics of photography composition. She talked about light and shadow, about finding the story in ordinary moments, about how the camera sees differently than the human eye, and that's what makes it powerful. She was nervous at first. I could see it in how she gripped her notes too tightly, in how her voice wavered slightly on the first few sentences. But then someone asked a question about shutter speed and Margaret answered it, and then someone else asked about aperture, and before long she'd forgotten to be nervous. She was just teaching, sharing something she loved with people who wanted to learn it. I'd never seen her look more alive. After class, students lingered to ask more questions. Margaret answered each one patiently, pulling up examples on her phone, offering to send them links to tutorials and resources. When the last student finally left, she walked over to where I was still sitting. "Well?" she asked. "Was I terrible?" "You were incredible," I said honestly. She sat down in the chair next to mine, exhausted but glowing. "I can't believe I almost said no to this. I almost let fear make this decision for me." "But you didn't," I pointed out. "You said yes. You showed up. You did the hard thing even though you were scared." Margaret looked at me for a long moment. "We're not going to date, are we?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but she continued before I could. "I don't mean that sadly," she clarified. "I mean it realistically. You're 31. I'm 59. You're my ex-girlfriend's boyfriend from years ago. The optics alone would be complicated in ways neither of us needs. But more than that, I think what we have is something different. Something better, maybe." I thought about it and realized she was right. What I felt for Margaret wasn't romantic attraction. It was something deeper and quieter. Respect. Admiration. The kind of caring that comes from watching someone fight their way back to themselves and being honored they let you witness it. "You're right," I said. "But I'm grateful for whatever this is. For you letting me be part of your life while you figured out who you are outside of being David's wife. And I'm grateful you figured out who you are outside of being Rebecca's safe boyfriend," Margaret said. "Look at us. Two people who spent years playing small, finally learning how to take up space. We stayed friends after that. Real friends. The kind who check in every few weeks, who send each other articles and photos, who show up for each other's important moments without needing anything in return." I went to her gallery showing 8 months later when she displayed her photography at a small exhibition space in downtown Phoenix. The work was stunning, black and white portraits of ordinary people doing ordinary things, but she'd captured something true in each face. Something vulnerable and human and beautiful. Margaret met someone about a year after her divorce finalized. A man named Thomas who worked as a librarian and had never heard of David Sullivan. They moved slowly, carefully, both of them carrying their own histories of relationships that had taught them what they didn't want. I met him once at a coffee shop and liked him immediately. He looked at Margaret like she was someone worth listening to, like her thoughts and words actually mattered. As for me, I stopped playing life like someone afraid to lose. I applied for a position at a medical device startup that paid less but challenged me more. I started saying yes to things that scared me a little. I dated someone briefly and it didn't work out, but I survived the ending without building new walls around myself. I learned that being careful and being alive weren't the same thing, that sometimes the scariest choice is the one worth making. That night at the fundraiser taught me something I carry with me still. We're not defined by our first response to someone's pain. We're defined by whether we're willing to show up anyway when we realize we got it wrong the first time. I said no to Margaret when she needed help, but I said yes when she gave me a second chance. And that second yes mattered more than the first no. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong and try again.